Welcome, everybody, to the Rolla Public Library's latest and final installment of the Missouri Bicentennial Series. Today's guest is Stephen Watts, a historian over at the University of Missouri and author of numerous biographies, including the first full-scale biography of Dale Carnegie, who we'll be talking about in today's episode. Enjoy. Welcome to the program, Steve.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
Now, Dale Carnegie was born in Maryville, Missouri, November 24th, 1888, basically to poor Missouri farmers. What were some of the challenges that Dale and his family would have had here in rural Missouri?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that young Dale Carnegie and his family faced was poverty. His parents both came from extremely modest backgrounds. And after they married, James Carnegie, his father, launched a career as a farmer up in the Maryville area. And according to all accounts, he was possibly one of the worst farmers that the state of Missouri ever produced. He just wasn't very good at it. He apparently was quite stubborn in opposing sort of new techniques like fertilizers of any kind. He had terrible luck with his crops, with raising animals. And for year after year after year in Dale Carnegie's childhood, he barely eked out a living, barely sort of keeping a roof over the family's head. And the poverty that the Carnegie family faced was really quite noticeable. He was a very hardworking man, but just not very good at it. And in later years, Dale Carnegie would recount, for example, that the family would be embarrassed when they went to the local town for supplies or for groceries or the like, that their family wagon was pulled by not two horses or two mules, but one horse and one mule, which is sort of all that they had. And apparently, in the sort of protocols of the time, that just wasn't done. It was a kind of sign that you were not doing too well. So poverty, sort of just barely eking out a living, I think, was the biggest problem they had. Also, you have to keep in mind that that area at that time was really just on the edge of the frontier era, and social economic conditions were rather backward. For example, disease swept through the area where young Dale Carnegie lived on a regular basis, and he had sort of a horrifying story when he was a kid about smallpox striking the community where they were. His mother being terrified when a little girl who lived on a farm across the road and just down a ways got sick and died within about a 24-hour period. And young Dale and his brother had been at that house during the time she became ill. She was terrified that her boys were going to come down with smallpox. And they buried the young girl quickly to help avoid that. And they did not come down with it. But that kind of thing was sort of common currency. So it was a rough background in a lot of ways for Carnegie and his family.
In your book, Self-Help Messiah, you write about some of the experiences he had, including losing a finger. He had immense love for his dog, Tippy, which kind of died tragically. How are some of these experiences, how did these impact Dale Carnegie and who he was?
Well, it might be a comment on human nature that no matter how hard the life actually was, the Dale Carnegie actually predominantly in his memories had happy happy memories of his own childhood. He viewed being out in the woods as a kid, sort of romping through the fields and nature with creeks and animals and all the wonderful things in a kind of rural setting. It really was a kind of an idyllic existence, as he would talk about later, despite all of the actual problems they faced. He did, as you mentioned, he had a deep love of animals that seemed to have stemmed. He had a dog named Tippy, a little dog who was his kind of boon companion as a little boy, accompanying him on his romps through the fields and the woods. And tragically, there was a terrible storm, which may have been a tornado, that swept through. The family had to sort of dash for safety, and they had to do it so quickly they did not have time to grab Tippy. And when they came out from hiding, an hour or two later, tragically, the dog had been killed in the storm. And young Dale Carnegie was just heartbroken about that. It took him weeks to recover from it. Another thing I believe you also mentioned a moment ago, sort of typical of rural life at that time, which could be quite dangerous. Dale and a friend were playing in a barn. I don't remember if it was his family's barn or a neighbor's barn, but they were fooling around, sort of jumping out of the loft into piles of hay, fooling around, playing as kids will do. And Dale Carnegie sort of swung out of a doorway up the top part of the barn. And in so doing, he caught his finger on a nail that had been protruding there. And basically, it sort of ripped his finger off. And the poor kid fell to the ground screaming in pain. And his friend recovered the remnant of the finger. And they ran to get his mother. And of course, horrified, they sort of threw Dale in the back of a wagon, rushed to the doctor. And he later recounted the horror of that trip, sort of bouncing along country roads in god awful pain with his finger torn off. And the doctor, of course, at that time was not able to sort of reconnect the finger, but he sort of sewed it up and applied medicine and the like. So he lost that finger for the rest of his life. So it was kind of a mixed background, I think, that carried on in his later life. On the one hand, you had this idyllic memories of life in the countryside that he really sincerely cherished. On the other hand, you had these sort of flashes of memory of really hard things, difficult, painful things that happened that were kind of in the background, and they would flash out occasionally.
You mentioned his mother, Amanda.
Right.
In your book, you talk about how she emphasized both religion and education in kind of his upbringing.
Right.
How did Dale Carnegie absorb his mother's worldview, and then how did he depart from it?
Well, by all accounts from the family and from the records that have survived, Dale Carnegie very much took after his mother. His mother was enthusiastic. She was outgoing. She was very communicative with other people. She was a kind of public speaker. And as a very religious Methodist lady, she would sort of give lay sermons and lay talks on religion to groups in her area and in neighboring states occasionally as well. She would go out to give talks. She was very keen on reading, had a small library in the house, and she sort of, I think, carried over to her son that love of education and reading that became a kind of lifelong mark of his as well. So he took after her a great deal in his personal habits, in his inclinations, in his interests, in his habits, and so on. She was a very pious woman, a very devout woman. And in early life, I think Dale Carnegie even copied that. He would go with her to religious meetings, and she would sort of take him up on the stage with her, and he would sit proudly by her as she talked and sort of chip in with hymns and songs and the singing and the like. So went quite along with the piety of his mother as a kid. Later on, what you would see is, and we can talk about that a little later, maybe when he gets to college, what you see is that Dale Carnegie sort of kept the substance of his mother's personality and habits, but he drifted away quite definitely from the religious orientation, and he began to have serious doubts about that side of his mother's heritage.
So I believe he's attended college in Warrensburg, Missouri.
Yes.
And yeah, and then so how did that experience in college start impacting his worldview? How does his worldview start maturing as he's in college?
Well, Dale Carnegie entered Warrensburg Teachers College when he reached adolescence. His father gave up farming finally, and the whole family moved down to Warrensburg. And by and large, Dale Carnegie had a very pleasant experience at college. It was a bit awkward at first because of his poverty. He only had very old patched clothing, which he was forced to wear to class. He was very unsophisticated country boy. His manners were a little rough and crude and so on. And he very much felt that he didn't fit in at Warrensburg at first. And he had difficulty, for example, when he was interested in young ladies, asking them out on dates, that they would sort of stick their nose up and roll their eyes and refuse to go out with him and so on. So all of that was a bit difficult, but Dale Carnegie loved studies. He loved his classes. He loved learning, and he took that to that like a duck to water. And from the very beginning, the education part of college, he did very, very well in. And as he prospered in his classes, got very good grades and so on, his self confidence began to rise up. And in addition, what he discovered was that he had a kind of talent for public speaking that I think was tied to his mother's influence, actually. And in colleges and universities at that time, we may recall public speaking was a very big deal. It was something that social clubs did, fraternities, sororities. They had competitions on a yearly, sometimes semester basis for public declamations and the reciting of speeches and poems and speaking on your own, et cetera, et cetera. And Dale Carnegie found that that was his way to success in college. Later, he recalled that athletics was one path, and he was a terrible athlete. He could barely put one foot down in front of the other, and the other was public speaking, at which he excelled. And as he sort of honed his chops at that kind of thing, won a bunch of contests at Warrensburg, he became very much a kind of big man on campus, actually, and a leader of his class. And the public speaking proved to be sort of the highlight of his college years in a lot of ways. The other thing I can note sort of quickly is that as part of his learning, he also became a religious skeptic, and he began to reject the kind of traditional Christianity of his mother, what he had learned in the Methodist Church. And actually, she got very upset at him because he would go home and challenge her on theological questions and religious issues and steadily drifted away. And that drove a bit of a wedge between them over that because it was so important to his mother. But that was another offshoot of his college days that proved very influential.
Now, what are some of the jobs that Dale Carnegie took on before he kind of became this public speaking guru?
Right. Well, after leaving Warrensburg Teachers College, I think it's fair to say Carnegie spent several years spinning his wheels. He wanted to earn some money, and he decided to become a salesman for a meatpacking company in Omaha, Nebraska. And he sort of went on the road trying to be a salesman. Uh, did so at that, but really didn't make very much money. And over the next several years, we see him sort of cycling through a number of different endeavors. He tried to become a car salesman for a short time. He became an actor. He decided he'd been involved with some amateur theatrics, and he actually decided to go east, young man, to become successful. Went to New York City to study acting. He tried that for a while, went on the road with a traveling theater troupe for a few months in a play. Very modest success there. It was obvious he wasn't going to make a living there. He tried being a journalist for a while, wrote a couple of articles, got published, but again, sort of limited success. He decided he wanted to be a novelist. So he tried writing a novel, the manuscript of which has survived. And he was sort of horrified to discover that people who read it told him quite accurately, I'm afraid, that he really wasn't a very good novelist. So that didn't exactly pan out either. So he went through a number of jobs and avocations trying to find some footing in the world. And where he found it actually was quite by happenstance. As he was scrambling around looking for himself, he saw that the local YMCA in New York offered evening classes, and he was getting rather desperate for money at this point. So he went to the local YMCA and he offered to teach an evening class for adults on public speaking, his old specialty back at Warrensburg Teachers College. And he offered to do it on commission, just making a set amount of money for whatever students he was able to attract. And at first, as with the other thing, he struggled with this, but he eventually found that he sort of learned by doing how to teach public speaking, and his classes slowly but surely began to grow. And as his classes grew, his popularity grew. He eventually began to branch out with YMCA, teaching courses in the New York area, out in the boroughs, into New Jersey, eventually down to Philadelphia and the like. So he really found his avocation, his career, teaching public speaking for the YMCA, and it turned out to be a very sort of lucky break for him as things unfolded in his future.
How do you believe his interest and his work in developing classes related to public speaking? How does that how is that reflected later in his kind of the success ideology that's developed and expressed
Mm.
through how to win friends and influence people?
Well, that's a very good question because public speaking was really the foundation upon which he built the later book and really his own mature career that later on would be so fabulously successful. And really, the key to it is that as Carnegie taught public speaking, what he emphasized were several things. He emphasized that speakers needed to develop self confidence. So that was a key quality that he hit very hard. He insisted that they develop a kind of positive thinking about what they were doing and about their ability to reach other people. And he sort of drilled into his students that positive thinking, positive mental attitude was a key to all of this. And he also stressed something else, that the key to public speaking was not sort of the old fashioned 19th century Victorian formalistic style of speaking, where there was a great emphasis on gesturing, on sort of a grand use of language, on sort of posturing in a lot of ways. If you think back to sort of that earlier period and the great public Daniel Webster like speakers, what Carnegie pushed was a very modern notion of this, that all of that stuff was not that important, but human relations was what was important, reaching other human beings and sort of connecting with them emotionally in a kind of direct way, and you liking them and them liking you, and creating this kind of bond of trust. And all of these sort of emotional and psychological techniques were really at the heart of his notion of public speaking. And as we will later see, those same ideas are really what lay at the heart of much of his success writing in How to Win Friends and Influence People as well. So the public speaking is really where all of that started.
Now, as he's growing and he's developing his career, there's a slight name change. Can you tell us what the significance of that name change is?
Absolutely. I think that's a really fascinating sort of pivot point in Carnegie's life as a young man. The original spelling of his name, the family spelling, was Carnegie, Carnagey. And when Dale Carnegie is in New York launching his career teaching public speaking, getting bigger and bigger classes, beginning to branch out, teaching public speaking to corporations, businesses, or beginning to send their executives to Carnegie to learn about human relations, talking to other people, et cetera, et cetera. Carnegie makes a decision to change the spelling of his name and the pronunciation as well, and he changed it to Carnegie, Carnegie. So from Carnegie to Carnegie. And I think there were several things involved with that, which I found quite fascinating. What this really involved, I think, was Dale Carnegie really reinventing himself, establishing a new identity. And I think it involved sort of pushing way into the background that kind of rural, provincial, poverty stricken young man from out in the sticks of Missouri, uh, and pushing to the fore this new, confident, sort of urban young man who was making something of himself. Uh, Secondly, I think what's sort of interesting and important is Carnegie very much into positive thinking, projecting yourself, projecting your own success by thinking positively about yourself and the world you're encountering. And if you think about it, when you change away from Carnegie, what is removed there is that kind of no, at the beginning, in the very middle of his name, and sort of just dispensing with it. And I think psychologically, that was sort of tied up with this sort of really keen emphasis on positive thinking as well. Thirdly, as Carnegie himself noted, one of the most successful and famous people in America at that time, really the epitome of the self made man, was Andrew Carnegie, the famous industrialist, the steelmaker, sort of heroic self made man figure. And as Dale Carnegie noted, it didn't exactly hurt that Dale Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie weren't that far apart, sort of association wise, in the public mind. So I think all of those things fed the name change, which was a kind of, again, a kind of pivot point, I think, in Carnegie's life.
Now, at some point, Dale Carnegie kind of transitions from a public speaking guru to a very kind of self-help guru. He's writing, how to win friends and influence people, and then after
Mhm.
World War II, he's writing how to stop worrying and start living. And in your view, how does this, Dale Carnegie used to say he liked to practice practical psychology, and
Right,
in your book, you link this idea of practical psychology to a concept called the therapeutic culture.
right.
Uh, what is this therapeutic culture, and how is Dale Carnegie kind of reflecting it?
Right, that's a very, very important point. Um, I think to understand Carnegie and the success of How to Win Friends and Influence People and his career as a success writer, what we have to understand is that the early 20th century framed a really important cultural shift in American history, away from the old Victorian standards of the 1800s, which had emphasized self denial, self control, the character ethic, sort of stern, upright moral behavior as the standard for responsible and successful people. What do you see as a shift away from all of that in the very end of the 1800s, the first couple decades of the 1900s, under the influence of psychology, I think, and also I think a kind of consumer economy as well? You see culture in this country beginning to drift in the direction of not self control and self denial, but in the direction of self fulfillment as a kind of cultural ideal, a kind of self fulfillment that is tied to personality, the development of personality rather than character, that is developed along the lines of fulfilling needs rather than repressing them, as the old Victorian standard would have had it. And what you see as psychology is playing a very important role in this cultural ferment and change in the early 20th century. You know, Freud, Alfred Adler, William James, a whole host of psychological thinkers are beginning to talk about mental health, about mental states, about psychological states as being key to understanding human beings and their impulses, what they need, what they want, et cetera, et cetera. And as a lot of historians have written, myself included, I might add, what you see really in a lot of ways is that it is religion in the 19th century that is increasingly replaced by this kind of therapeutic calculus of psychology to explain what people are like, what they should be doing, how they can be happy, sort of the larger goals of life and that kind of thing. So, what you see is that Carnegie's success writing emerges in the heart of this cultural transition from character to personality, from religion to therapy, from scarcity to this notion of an abundant life, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those big cultural changes, I think, are kind of looming in the background to explain why his endeavor was so successful.
Now, How to Win Friends and Influence People, it was published in 1936. What is it about this book that appealed to people in the context of the Great Depression?
Well, it's a very interesting thing to note in a kind of practical historical sense that How to Win Friends and Influence People was published in the heart of the biggest economic disaster in American history. The Great Depression began in 1929 and lingered well up into the early 1940s, over a decade in this country. But for our purposes today, I think what's sort of interesting to note here is that the Great Depression was, of course, economic in its substance, economic disaster when the bottom fell out of the American economy. But it was not just that. It was also a kind of emotional crisis of stupendous proportions in American life for common, ordinary Americans. And I think one of the only things we have to recall to underline that is Franklin Roosevelt's famous inauguration speech, where he declared famously, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And what he was addressing there was what lots of people knew, commented on, struggled with, and that is the kind of tremendous atmosphere of fear that permeated American life for maybe the first time in its history. People were fearful about where their next meal was coming from, but they were also fearful about what was going to happen to them and their families and what was going to happen to the country. Anxiety, stress, all of these things, fear, permeated American life. And one thing that Carnegie's book promised, How to Win Friends and Influence People, was in its kind of perky, positive, inimitable style, was that fear could be overcome, that people could be successful, that there were modern techniques for moving ahead in life, and making something of yourself, and getting out from under this god awful dark cloud of fear in American life. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think connects the Depression to Carnegie's book was his audience, sort of demographically. The big audience for Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, was primarily white collar bureaucrats, not the wealthy, not the real poverty stricken, but sort of upper middle class, or excuse me, upper working class, middle class people in white collar, bureaucratic corporate America that had emerged over the last 20 or 25 years, people who had white collar jobs in bureaucratic settings with lots of other people. How to Win Friends and Influence People was a guidebook for how to prosper in a bureaucracy, how to deal with other people, how to relate to other people in a work setting, how to sort of climb ahead in your interactions with other people, et cetera, et cetera. And for a white collar audience in the Depression who may not have fallen into poverty, but were fearful of doing so at any moment if this continued, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People was a kind of lifesaver thrown out to them there in the water, where they could see their way to future success by reading it. So I think the Depression, in an immediate historical way, sort of provided a very rich setting for Carnegie's book to be as popular as it was. And it was enormously popular.
What are some of the ways in which it was popular? Like, what are some of the metrics?
Well, the most obvious one is that I think, to the utter shock of both Dale Carnegie and his publisher, Leon Shimkin at Simon and Schuster, they had expected a modest success, sell several thousand copies, maybe a few tens of thousands of copies if they're lucky. The book began to fly off the shelves, and within, I think, 6 months, it had sold 250,000 copies, which was just, again, absolutely stunning to the author, the publisher alike. They had to rush it into reprint after reprint after reprint. Within a year or two, it had sold over 1 million copies, and it was just a kind of upward trajectory. That book has ended up selling somewhere in the vicinity, the last time I checked, 30 or 40 million copies, and dozens of republishings over the decades. One of the best-selling books in American history. So metrics-wise, I think that is sort of the immediate tip-off that this was a book that people were gobbling up, they were reading, they were listening to, and so on.
Now, as the book was taking off, several critics began to emerge, and they were raising kind of like the dark side of the success ideology that was reflected in How to Win Friends.
Right.
What are some of the issues that critics raised to this book?
Yes, it's a very interesting point as well. Well, the essence of Carnegie's message in How to Win Friends and Influence People is that the secret to success in modern life was human relations. And it was making other people feel important. I think that was one of his very biggest message. You make other people feel important, they will be sort of susceptible to your agenda, your ideas, your goals for whatever the project at hand may be. So you make other people feel important. Very much a kind of central thing that weaves its way in and out of this book, and he offered in that book various techniques for doing that. The other thing he talked about constantly in one garb or another was make people like you. Because if you make people or encourage people, prompt people to like you, if they like you, again, the road will be paved for you to be successful, to get other people to do what you would like them to do, to follow your lead, to put your projects into play, et cetera, et cetera. That was the essence of his message, and all of the chapters and the directives that he had in that book sort of revolve around those two things. Well, as a number of critics noted when the book came out, and some famous ones such as James Thurber, the humorist, the writer, Sinclair Lewis, the novelist, a particularly scathing critic of Carnegie, what a number of critics alighted on was what really was a kind of central problem in Carnegie's message, and that is the problem of sincerity and manipulation. And what these critics argued is that, well, when you boil Carnegie's message down in that book, what he's really urging you to do and giving you instructions to do is how to manipulate people, manipulate them emotionally, manipulate them by flattering them, et cetera, et cetera. And what this really was how to create yes men, people who will simply approve of others and sort of flatter them and shape them and do what you will in order to get ahead. This, they argued, was a very cynical sort of program. It was very inauthentic. It was insincere. And what it really did was to raise the specter of an old kind of boogeyman in American culture, and that is the con man, the confidence man, which had been lurking about since the 19th century in American cultural life. The con man who will tell you anything, who will sell you any kind of product, no matter how flawed it is, with a kind of fancy line of talk in order to get your money and then skip out of town. And basically, what the critics suggested was that Dale Carnegie was taking the con man and sort of normalizing him, mainstreaming him, and making the con man the figure of success and how to be success in modern America. So this was a real bone of contention. Carnegie, of course, when he would read these reviews or this kind of criticism, it upset him deeply, because I think it's fair to say that he genuinely believed what he was arguing, and he kept emphasizing in his responses is to be sincere. Don't lie to people. Don't flatter them with things that aren't true, but sincere approbation of others, sincere approval of other people's good traits, sincere positive human relations. So this was the kind of fulcrum upon which all of this swang. The cynics sort of saying that this was heading us down the primrose path to manipulation and sort of con jobs as the ordinary of American life. Carnegie insisting that sincerity was the heart of his message, and it was sort of never the twain shall meet.
That's interesting, and it's kind of interesting too because so many self-help icons today, that's kind of the complaint that would be lodged against them in many instances.
Well, it is. In a lot of ways, I think that very issue is sort of the Achilles heel for a lot of success messages, and especially the folks who are peddling success, who become quite rich off of doing so. That's an important issue that's continued to linger in these discussions. You're right.
Now, if we fast forward a bit, he wrote How to Stop Worrying and Start Living after World War II. And, it's a time of growing prosperity in America.
Right.
We have the war behind us, the Great War. Why was this book necessary for that time?
Well, Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living book of, I believe, 1948 was really a kind of reflection, once again, of the historical period in which it was written. And that is a kind of post-World War II American economy where abundance, consumer prosperity, is emerging as the order of the day. The economy had been repaired during World War II from the Great Depression, and it comes roaring out of the war, sort of shifting gears from the production of armaments to the production of consumer goods. By the late 40s, the early 1950s, consumer prosperity is sort of the name of the game in American life. Great chunks of the American middle class, even the American working class, are enjoying a kind of prosperity, job security, standard of living that was simply unprecedented in American history. But what accompanied that, of course, was, as seems to be the case with human life in general, is new problems emerge with new advances. And what you had was growing discussions, even by the late 40s, of the fact that economic well being had solved human problems on that pragmatic side of the ledger. But right along with it, what you saw was growing anxiety, growing stress, growing sort of uncertainty psychologically about how to be happy in this new sort of cornucopia of abundance. You know, you're awash in consumer goods. Does that make you happy? Well, maybe up to a point, but maybe not as well. There's lots of talk about the age of anxiety, about how to deal with these new problems that had emerged of simply being happy in a life where material needs were being met. And what Carnegie's book was, how to be happy and start living, was a kind of examination of, once again, the psychological side of life, his old friend. And basically, what Carnegie does in this book is he offers a kind of set of directives for people becoming happy in an age of prosperity. And he talks about the great need for people to focus on self fulfillment, on identifying those factors in life that genuinely make them happy and pursuing those in a kind of steady way, not being stressed out by things that weren't terribly important. He talks about the importance of self esteem, of people sort of working on building up their own valuation of themselves in the world. And he relies again on positive psychology, positive thinking a lot in these kinds of directives as well. So, what you have really is another kind of success book, only one tailored, I think, to the post war world of prosperity rather than that old depression era world of want, of economic want that had been the case 10 or 12 years earlier. And once again, he seemed to touch a kind of public nerve with this book because, again, it became a bestseller, one of the 2 or 3 best-selling books in 1948. Not as successful as How to Win Friends and Influence People, but a bestseller in its own right as well.
Who are some self-help icons who followed in the footsteps of Dale Carnegie?
Well, I think by the 1950s, the 1960s, and then the succeeding decades in the late 20th century, you see a whole host of sort of therapeutic success writers that emerge in all kinds of fields of endeavor. One actually in Carnegie's own lifetime that emerges almost alongside him was Norman Vincent Peale in the area of religion. Peale becomes quite famous and influential by melding psychology with religion and creating a kind of therapeutic religious framework for finding happiness in the world. But you know, by the 1980s, the 1990s, you see people like Tony Robbins with his infomercials on television about sort of neuroscience, marshaling your mental resources to become successful. You see people like Melody Beattie talking about codependency and the need to eject from your life bad psychological hangups and dependencies on others in order to become self-fulfilled and happy. You see Stephen Covey talking about the 7 habits of successful people in business and public enterprise. You see Deepak Chopra offering his own version of sort of the road to happiness. And all of these are sort of various therapeutic visions of how to be successful and happy in the modern world. My own personal favorite, because she was such a tremendously influential public figure who is still with us, actually is Oprah Winfrey, who has become, of course, a kind of mega force in the late 20th, early 21st century as a kind of cultural figure. And in her own writings and her projects across all kinds of media, what you see is Oprah Winfrey, I think, channeling the kind of Dale Carnegie model of positive thinking, self-confidence, human relations, et cetera, as a kind of platform or a kind of paradigm for how to become successful and happy in the modern world. And I think Oprah, in her own way, has kind of made the Carnegie message a kind of cultural art form, I think, by the early years of our own time. So I think those figures, and there are dozens of others I can mention as well, who I think have walked down that same path that Carnegie highlighted back in the 30s of how to win friends and influence people.
Now, you've written several biographies as a student of communication and, I'm working in a library. So, if libraries involve communication, I find your books fascinating just because there's so many of these people were really kind of very involved with the mass communication process. Of course, Dale Carnegie. And one of the points you made here about Dale Carnegie was that a lot of his communication was around empowerment, but also about kind of the self-fulfillment culture. And I'm
Right.
wondering, can you connect your work and your research on Dale Carnegie to some of the other writings you've done, Walt Disney and Hugh Hefner? How does this connect? How does this idea of self-fulfillment expressed, and how is this connected with your other writings?
Right. Well, I think all of my biographies, excuse me, Disney, Henry Ford, Hugh Hefner, uh, um, Dale Carnegie. I'm writing a book right now on Will Rogers, who was a kind of multimedia figure in this same general area. What all those books are about, stepping back to put a big historical lens on all of this, is really about this transition, I think, from Victorian America in the 19th century to modern America in terms of sort of dominant mainstream cultural forms, habits, values. And what it's all involved with is the kind of paradigm I talked about at the very beginning of our discussion is by the very late 1800s, you begin to see a kind of withering away of those old mainstream standards of character, self-control, the work ethic, uh, all of those things that were sort of the bulwarks of Victorian bourgeois society in the 19th century. And you see replacing them a new set of standards that emerges slowly over the first few decades of the 20th century and historically. And these include things like personality instead of character, leisure instead of the work ethic, uh, and so on. Consumer capitalism instead of the old kind of early stages of producer capitalism in the 19th century. All the figures I write about, I think, are involved in that watershed in some kind or another. Walt Disney, of course, through films, cartoons, live action films, later amusement parks, all kinds of media. You see Henry Ford doing it with the automobile because the automobile becomes quite literally a kind of carrier of new modern experiences in the modern world. And Henry Ford advertises the automobile as not just a mechanism for doing practical things, but a purveyor of new experiences. You use the automobile to get out in the world, to be self fulfilled in all kinds of ways that were not possible in an earlier age. You see Hugh Hefner doing it in a much later period with his Playboy magazine, where you see the kind of dicta that he offers for how to lead a self fulfilled life. Self fulfillment is really the name of the game for Hugh Hefner in all kinds of ways, culturally, by the time we get to the 60s and 70s. And I think Dale Carnegie is of a piece with this as well, because what he's talking about is a kind of modern formula for the old success seeking that is so central, I think, to what Americans are all about, how to become successful, individual success. He takes those old notions, that old striving, and he really translates it into a kind of new modern idiom that reflects these new cultural standards of personality, of human relations, of consumer prosperity, of self esteem, of psychology, of a kind of therapeutic sensibility. All of that is sort of packaged with a very bright sort of ribbon and bow in how to win friends and influence people. And I think in that, Carnegie fits right in with a lot of the other cultural figures I explore who are part of that same vast historical process.
It seems that Dale Carnegie's legacy continues to be fairly strong, and I was just 2 weeks ago checking out books at the library, and somebody, a teenager had Napoleon Hill's book, and then right underneath it, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I asked her, "Have you read Tony Robbins?" "Oh yeah, Unlimited
Yeah.
Power. Love that book." So these are books that still have relevance. What do you think that says about American culture in the 21st century?
Well, I think what it testifies to is really how deeply the kind of therapeutic sensibility has embedded itself in modern America to influence how we think, how we look at the world, how we sort of understand other human beings, how we understand ourselves. And I think the continued popularity of Dale Carnegie and the legions of other success writers who have followed in his wake, I think that is just historical evidence for the very deep seated way in which we have become a kind of therapeutic culture uh, that continues to be so, I think, in the early 21st century. And I think the kid who's checking out that book or those books is a kind of walking, talking piece of evidence for the state of our culture now. As I always like to put it when I'm ending these things, I think it's an interesting way to think about it. It was Thomas Jefferson who coined the phrase, that most American of phrases that we all know, we've all heard, the pursuit of happiness, that America is about the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson, back in the late 1700s, but in a lot of ways, I think it's Dale Carnegie, the country boy from Missouri who went to New York. It was Dale Carnegie who provided the modern definition of what the pursuit of happiness means for us, and I think continues to mean for us as Americans today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for being here today. And as we conclude, I just want to give you the opportunity. Where can people find your books and learn more about your research and read your writings?
Well, I think probably the easiest place is just to look up Stephen Watts, author, on the web, and you'll come across my books for sale in lots of different venues. I also have a website, StephenWattsAuthor.com, that readers can go to, that has a lot of different information about my writings and various projects I am involved in and have been involved in. So interested readers can go there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.